Hi there, hello, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Machiavelli's Discourses. We today are looking at chapter 37 of the Discourses. We're still in book 1. Again, we're still in book 1, which has 58 chapters, and we are in 37. Title is What Scandals the Agrarian War agrarian law gave birth to in Rome, and that to make a law in a republic that looks very far back and is against an ancient custom of the city is most scandalous. Now, this is a question of agrarian law, but the changing of the agrarian regulations. And he says, now the title here is that, okay, in the agrarian law, the scandals that gave birth to in Rome. And the question is, when you make a law in a republic that looks very back, goes back, and is against the ancient custom of a city, this is scandalous. Okay, this is the point. So therefore, let's go into this point. It is the verdict of ancient writers that men are wont to worry in evil and to become bored with good, and that from both of these two passions, the same effect arises. Now, this is, these words have not been identified in ancient writers, but their verdict seems to be cynical, pessimistic outlook, as opposed to the modern progressives. See Plato's Laws, 687c, Aristotle's Republic, 1361a1 to b26, in Polybius, book 6, section 9. These are the ancient writers. He said, therefore, this is, the author. They suggest there's not an exact citation who it belongs to. It's not clear. It's clearly not a modern writer. The suggestion is by the editors, and it points to Plato and the Laws, and Aristotle and his Politics. And so, in other words, the idea here is that two things that drive men. Men are wont to worry in evil. So when there's evil about and they're afraid, worry. In other words, they're, in a way, fear. And boredom. When good times happen, they get bored. And therefore, from these two passions, the same effect arises. In other words, they do stupid things, and so many things happen. So boredom and worry, right? Worry from fear, worry out of fear, or from an evil, from a negative thing. Worry from evil, worry and evil. We want to worry and evil and become bored with good. These are the two things. So worry out of fear and boredom, right? This is the two dangers, the same effects. For whenever engaging in combat through necessity is taken from men, they engage in combat through ambition, which is so powerful in human breast that it never abandons them at whatever rank they rise to. So therefore, in other words, even if, physical combat, in other words, engaging in combat is necessary, taken from them. They are men fighting, physically fighting. When that's taken from them, right? Well, they will still compete because of ambition. And this will never cease, he says, no matter how much rank or their position changes. Like it won't go, if those who are ambitious and they want to contest, they will strive. Strivers and people who are ambitious will strive all the time. Regardless of how much things. It won't get a point where the nature of men are such that they won't necessarily get to a point and they'll get comfortable. Real strivers, the strivers who will continue their kind of utility maximizers, or they want to always achieve a strive for greater things. Competition and ambition. Their ambition it needs to be satisfied more and more and more. Okay. The cause is that nature has created men so that they are able to desire everything and are unable to attain everything. So they can desire, again, this is a great Machiavellian point. that men have nature designs men that they can desire everything, but not attain everything. Okay, so there's a gap between what men desire versus what they can obtain. So since the desire is always greater than the power of acquiring, the result is discontent with what one possesses and a lack of satisfaction with it. So again, in other words, because the power of acquiring, to want, where I want something is I want to acquire it, I want to get it, I want to have it. So therefore, the desire to require, again, this is again repeating something that Machiavelli says in the Friends. The desire to acquire is ordinary, right? He says it's something natural, this is going to be there. And the problem with the desire to require is that it's greater than in other words, the desire is always greater than acquiring it, the power of getting it. Desire of wanting things, desire is always greater than the power to acquire, to getting it. And the result is discontent and unhappiness with what one has. I always want something more. You always want something more. This is the thing that, the grass is always greener, right? The metaphor. In other words, that you're not happy with what you have. You look at the other thing, and you think it's better over there, right? From this arises the variability of their fortune. So therefore, different people have different fortunes, right? From this not being satisfied, is the variability of the fortune. Since some men desire to have more, and some fear to lose what has been acquired, they come to enmity and to war, from which arises the ruin of one province and the exaltation of another. So there are two forces. One is I want something. I want the desire to acquire, and then the other one is the desire to keep, the fear of losing what I have, okay? Fear to lose what has been acquired. These are the two things, okay? The desire for more and the desire to keep, or the fear from losing what I have, right? And this contestation between people causes enmity, that I want, you don't want, you're afraid of me because you look at me and that person wants what I have, and I want to protect what I have, and this leads to enmity and to wars, right? And then this was what also he says, the ruin of one province and the exaltation, the greater one getting better, right? The next one getting greater, bigger, right? I have made this discourse because it was not enough for the Roman plebe to secure itself against the nobles by the creation of the tributes, to which desire it was constrained by necessity. For having obtained that, it began at once to engage in combat through ambition, and to wish to share the honors and belongings with the nobility as the things esteemed most by men. So in other words, it wasn't just good enough that they get representation or they get a protection. In other words, the establishment of the tribute was simply not enough. What happened was to secure themselves against the nobles. In other words, it wasn't just enough to get the tributes to secure them against the nobles, but rather to which, in other words, having done that, they begin to engage. Once they have secured themselves against the nobles, they now want to be equal with the nobles, to get the same privileges and get the same honors belonging to the nobles, right? Because they're the things that are esteemed by the nobility as the things esteemed by most men. Again, this is the substances, right? The things, the honors and things with the nobility. I think belonging is the wrong word. I think things are better. Substances, things. From this arose the disease that gave birth to the contention over the agrarian law. Again, 3 Livy, Book 2. The first agrarian law was promulgated by the Council Spurius Casus in 486 after the war with Heraclea. It gave land taken from the enemy to the plebs, right? The idea that they get law to the plebs. In other words, they gave birth to contention over the agrarian law, which in the end was the cause of the destruction of the republic. In other words, the fight about land, property, the way the agrarian law changed over time. This led to the original agrarian law favored the giving the land to the plebs, right? And therefore this was idea of moving the plebs up. In other words, Aristotle's conception. Aristotle's in book 4, The Politics, arguing that you don't want the lower classes to be poor, you want them to have some means of sustenance, and therefore giving them land is a means to have them sustenance. So you didn't want to make them completely poor, right? But the changes but it's the agrarian law which will cause the destruction of the republic, because well-ordered republics have to keep the public rich and the citizens poor. In other words, this is the idea. The public has to be rich, but the citizens can't be too rich, because if they get too rich, they get too ambitious, right? It must be that in the city of Rome, where there was a defect in this law, in a sense. Because why? Because the agrarian law did this is something. It ultimately didn't do this. It didn't keep the public collectively rich and the citizens poor. Either it was not made at the beginning, so that it did not have to be treated again every day, or they delayed so much in making it because looking back it might be scandalous, right? Again, for on the dangers of looking back Florentine histories, right? This, you might be scandalous, or if it was well ordered at first, it had been corrupted by later use. So in other words, they either didn't do it correctly at the beginning, it was not made at the beginning, right? So they had to treat it every day, and did not have to treat it every day, or they delayed as much as making it look, because looking back was scandalous, or if it was well ordered at first, it had been corrupted. So in whatever mode it might have been, one never spoke of this law in Rome without turning the city upside down. In other words, once you did the question of the agrarian law, again, book 2, verses 41 to 43. Whatever you do this, it will turn the city upside down. Paragraph 2. This law has two principal heads. In the one, it set forth that no citizen could possess more than so many acres of land, right? This is, again, Livy, book. This is book 6 of Livy. And in the other, that fields were taken from the enemy should be divided among the Roman people. Again, but this is book 4 of Livy history. It therefore it brought on offense of two sorts to the nobles. For those who possessed more goods than the law permitted, who were the greater part of the nobles, they had in other words, they had more than the law permitted, had to be deprived of them. And dividing the goods of enemies among the plebs took away from them the way to get rich. In other words, they couldn't get more money. In other words, by the very wealthy, the wealthy notables had already land. They couldn't get more land, and because they couldn't get more land, they couldn't get rich, right? And the plebs who got land, okay, therefore they could get rich. So since these offenses came to bear against powerful men, whom, as it appears to them, were defending the public in opposing it, whenever one was reminded of it, as was said, the whole city was turned upside down. So therefore, it was a problem. Once you try to deal with the thing, in other words, it was set up that since the regulation said you could only own this much land, and what happened was every time there was a situation They divided the land of the conquered areas, and that therefore only the notables could not get new land because they've had their max. So therefore they couldn't get, they don't get a share of the benefit, and therefore they get angry. They can't get rich, but these people can, and that therefore this creates also the envy that, wait a minute, I'm rich now, I'm as good as them, I deserve to have more say, right? This is why it turns the city upside down. With patience and industry, the nobles temporized it, either by lending an army out, or by having the tribute who proposed it opposed by another tribute, or by someone yielding to a part of it, or indeed by sending a colony to a place that had to be distributed. In other words, they found ways to temporize it. The nobles found a way to temporize it. One, if someone proposed a new law, an agrarian law, or something to change the regulation, they would find someone to oppose it. They would yield to a part of it, and they would send a colony to a place to be distributed. They'll send a colony over there to be distributed. This happened in the countryside around Anzio. When the dispute over the law resurged, a colony drawn from Rome, to which the said countryside was assigned, was sent to the place. Here, Titus Livy used a notable phrase, saying that only with difficulty was anyone found in Rome to give his name to go to that colony. So much was the plebs more willing to desire things in Rome than to possess them in Anzio, right? This is, again, Livy 2, verse 9. So, again, this is that important point that he makes, that they would like it, they desire it in Rome, but they don't want to go to Anzio, the plebs, right? So therefore this tempers them. The temper of, the 10, the humor of this law. In other words, its character, its nature, the internal fluctuation of this law. The humor of this law, when operating on this for a time until the Romans began to take their arms to the furthest part of Italy or outside Italy, after which it appears that it ceased. This came about because the fields the enemies of Rome possessed, being distant from the eyes of the plebs, and in places where it was not easy to cultivate them, came to be less desired by them. And also the Romans were less punitive to their enemies in a like mode. And when they despoiled any town of the countryside, they distributed colonies there, right? Okay, so therefore that was the big thing. So for such causes, this law lays as though asleep until the Gracchi. So therefore, this law really stays out there until it's asleep until the Gracchi rises. It doesn't become a problem. When it was aroused by them, although ruined Roman freedom. Now again, Plutarch's history of Gracchi, right? About Tiberius Gracchi. When it was aroused by them, it altogether ruined Roman freedom, for it found the power of its adversaries redoubled, and because of this, it inflamed so much hatred between the plebs and the Senate that they came to arms and to bloodshed, beyond every civil mode and custom. In other words, this is, okay, what happened? The idea is that when the Gracchi brought up the question, now the question here has to also understand, we have to understand that when the Gracchi bring it up, there's a very important thing that he's not talking about, we're forgetting. Hannibal has happened, and the Second Punic War. The Second Punic War is devastating. And that Hannibal so controlled the countryside that many of the small farms were kind of it led to the abandonment of the countryside by the plebs into the cities. Okay, so the plebeian farmers, who were the key for the soldiery, the war effort, the greatest effort of the war effort, that eventually will defeat the Romans. By Scipio. Scipio will defeat it, not in Rome. They remember, and the Romans don't defeat Hannibal in Italy; they defeat him in Carthage by Scipio, right? Which is there's a problem. So. But after the war, after the Second Punic War, the devastation of the war led to a situation, the new change of agriculture. Now, Machiavelli doesn't really talk about this, but the change of agriculture went from, one of the things that happened was the rise of these big plantations and the big Lufunda plantations and things like this, which were filled with slaves. And therefore they had huge land, therefore they went from, the nature of agriculture went from small farming to big farming by slaves, small plebeian farmers to the big lafundas manned by slaves that were conquered by first in not only Carthage but also conquered with the captures of the Greek wars, the Macedonian wars, right? The second or third Macedonian war, I think the third. So you have this conquest of slaves, increase of slaves, and therefore that changes the political economy. Now, Machiavelli's kind of silent about that. But that's why the Gracchi are making the reform in that sense, because there was a change. There was something unfair. The Gracchi will do this. But the problem was that once they came into this thing, it became so horrible. It led to the it led to that it inflamed the passions of the parties. They came to, the plebs in the Senate came to hate each other and to arm and to bloodshed beyond every civil mode and customs. Now, so since the public magistrates could not remedy it, none of the factions could put hope in them. They had recourse to private remedies, right, external remedies. And each one of the parties was thinking of how to make itself a head to defend it. In other words, there was no political means to resolve it. There was a public means to resolve this, he's saying. And therefore they only chose to private remedies. And each private remedy sought to create themselves a private armies, private forces that would act to defend the cause of these things, right? In this scandal and disorder, the plebs came first and gave reputation to Marius. Now, so that it made him consul 4 times, and he continued in this consulate with few intervals, so long as he was able to make himself consul 3 other times. As the nobility had no remedy against such a plague, it turned favoring Sulla, and when he had been made a head of its party, they came to civil wars. This is the fight. This is the first civil war in that sense. And you also have to remember the change of the militia. In other words, Marius is also important because Marius fundamentally changes the nature of the Roman army. Before it was a citizen army; it was paid by the citizens. Now, what happened was that what happened was that the land or the capture of the booty was given to the Republic. Now, what happened here was that the soldiers, the enterprises, were private. The generals could, first of all, they could hire. In other words, the Roman situation was the lowest orders could not be soldiers. Okay, you had to own some property. The lowest order of Roman society, who had nothing, they could not be recruited. Now, what Marius does is, well, instead of relying, yes, we keep the citizens, but we can have a situation where a general could pay out soldiers, buy them, pay for them, and give them a stake in the enterprise. And that when they go conquer something, whatever they conquer, they'll distribute to their soldiers. And therefore, this buys loyalty to the generals. Successful generals will have the loyalty of the men, usually of the lower orders, supporting them. And this is why the change of the nature of the situation, where there was private armies. Marius's reforms of the military to allow it to be what? Because remember, the danger of the old military, the Roman military, was really, because it was made up the plebeian orders of the second, not the bottom, but the middle and upper ranks of the plebeian classes, who had they owned things. They want to go back to their farms. They needed to do this. Now, this was devastated during the. In fact, these groups were devastated during the Carthaginian War. They were forced to abandon their farms and their things, and many of them ultimately sold off their farms in that sense, in order to basically people who were in fact, that was the change of the law. A lot of the law changed at that time to allow people to sell off the land, to allow bigger plantations, and the fact that you had people who came with slaves and like this, to be able to deliver that changed the nature of the agrarian law. So that, and what happened was, Gracchus wanted to reform it, to break up the big lafunda and return it back to the small farms, and to give the people the recourses. Now, both Gracchi are dealt with, negatively, hostile, killed both times, in that sense. And this teaches that if you don't have an army, you don't have people loyal to you with weapons, and therefore armed to fight well, the Senate will be able to, the Senate and the senatorial class will simply just kill them. So this is what Marius's reforms, and what Marius's situation does. Marius then supposedly champions the plebs, because he's giving them the means to, he's a good number of the lower orders are able first. They're going to be, this is a sign of a successful military operation in places, in either Greece or the Middle East, or around, the Pompey gets the sea and the pirates in the Mediterranean area and becomes very wealthy because of this. But so doesn't, Caesar goes to Gaul and others. You have these operations. But the first war becomes the tension between Sulla and, because remember, Sulla represents the side of the Senate, the nobles and the senatorial class. And what happens is the civil war between Marius and, the personal dislike of these two, because he was junior to him and claimed authority. There's a whole story about this. What is so interesting about this is that this is the first civil war, right? And they made him favoring Sulla, and when he had been made the head of the party, they came to civil war. After mud, bloodshed, and changing of fortune, the nobility was left on top, right? This is Plutarch's Sulla, right? Again, we have to turn to Plutarch's here. Plutarch's account. Later, these humors were revived at the time of Caesar and Pompey. So, what starts at this, there was a kind of levy. Sulla ultimately defeats and wins over, and remember, Sulla sets he makes himself dictator and is long reign dictator. And people say, oh, that was the bad thing. That was this is why the dictatorship was a problem. But Sulla's dictatorship was a conservative dictatorship in the sense that his attempt to restore the order, but also to moderate it. He introduced more middlemen, people of the middle class. Sulla did. One of them was Cicero. Cicero rises as one of the creations of Sulla in that sense. There were people like Cicero and his sword were not from the old senatorial class. These were the new men. But the problem with Sulla is that once he did it, it became, in other words, the resentment that happened by the forces who supported this, and then this gave rise to Pompey, Caesar and Pompey. Now, Caesar and Pompey originally were populists. Okay, they were the new generals who gave defense, and they had private royal armies. The problem was the fallout between what kept them together was marriage, but the marriage kind of when Caesar's daughter dies and Pompey's become closer to the Senate, and so therefore this is like Later these humors were revived at the time of Caesar and Pompey, for after Caesar had made himself head of the Marius party, and Pompey then that of the Sulla, again, this is why in coming to grips, Caesar was left on top. So, Machiavelli kind of gives a kind of slew, his take here on the history offers a kind of, cut, he's playing with it a little bit. He's cutting out a lot. This account really, he ignored the origins of why the land became a problem. He conflates the fact that Pompey, what really divided Pompey and Caesar was an envy between them, in that sense, an envy between them, and what was held together by pride. And then, Pompey, the Senate used the tension between the question of the first triumvirate, and the Senate decided to separate after the death of Caesar's daughter to Pompey. This led the senatorial class to make arrangement to create a rift, use the envy to create a rift, and then the idea that Pompey becomes that Pompey is the champion of the Senate class, or Sulla. Pompey was no Sulla. And that's what the coming to grips with Caesar was left on top, right? This is what ends up happening, right? The second civil war, right? He was the first tyrant in Rome, since that never again was that city free. Now, by saying this, this is again Plutarch and Aquinas on kingship, right? This is the classic view. This is the classic view that okay, sorry about that. That was I should have turned something off, and it wasn't off. And I better put this as that, in other words, Caesar becomes the entity of this. The idea that Caesar, this Roman Republic, is never the same. It's dead. It's over. The rise of Caesars end up creating the idea that it's no longer the Republic. It is. Cicero holds this view. He says that clearly in De Officiis. So therefore, this is the idea that Caesar, it was never left a free city. It was always Caesar's city, or that the forces of the problem is the people were corrupt in that sense. You can say. 3, such though were the beginnings and the ends of the agrarian law. Right. This is the beginning and the end of the agrarian law. Although we have shown elsewhere that the enmity in Rome between the Senate and the plebs kept Rome free by giving rise to the laws that favor freedom, right? Again, this is Discourses 1, chapter 14. And although the end of the agrarian law appears not to conform to such a conclusion, I say that I do not, because of this, abandon such an opinion. So he's not, just because the agrarian law went bad and the thing, I'm not going to say that the tension between the two were not good, or did not allow them to be free. For so great is ambition of the great that it soon brings that city to its ruin if it is not beaten down in a city by the various ways and various modes. In other words, for so great is the ambition of the great. So notice this is a critique of the ambition of the great. That it soon brings that city to its ruin if it is not beaten down in a city by various ways and various modes. In other words, you have to contend. You need to constrain ambition. What Machiavelli is saying here is that if you don't constrain the ambition of the great, they will destroy your city. They will ultimately fundamentally change the regime, destroy the current. If you have a free city, they will destroy this order, and they will impose a regime that favors their power or their interest. Therefore, they destroy the city. Bring the city to its ruin. So, if the contention over the agrarian law took 300 years to make Rome servile, it would perhaps have been led into servile much sooner if the plebs had not always checked the ambition of the nobles, both with this law and with the other appetites. In other words, the agrarian law was important because it checked the ambitions of the nobility. The destruction of the agrarian law allowed the ambitions of the nobility to have no check. But the problem with this is that it was in other words, the agrarian. He seems to suggest that in other words, if it wasn't for the mechanisms of the tension of checking the ambitions of the nobles, with this law and with the other appetites, in other words, it would destroy them. Earlier. Took 200 years over the agrarian law, before it made Rome servile. So therefore, it would happen. Servility would happen much quicker if they did not check the ambition of the great. See, Machiavelli seems to suggest the problem is the great, not the people. Here. It's the ambition of the great that leads to ruin. One also sees through this how much more men esteem property than honor. Okay, so therefore they care more about. In other words, you see this, that men care more for property than for honor. Therefore, they desire to acquire property. Some people acquire. But most men, he says, they also see that how much more men esteem property than honor. For the Roman nobility always yielded honors to the plebs without extraordinary scandals. But when it came to property, so great was its obstinacy in defending it that the plebs had recourse to extraordinary means that were discoursed of above to vent its appetite. In other words, 15 Discourses 1:4, right? The extraordinary means. You don't want to do that. That's very bad. You don't want extraordinary means. You want ordinary means. So he talked about this. He said that they're going to have the extraordinary means to vent their appetite, to protect them. In other words, and the rise of tributes, right? This idea of the tribute, this goes all the way back to the beginning of the see. Yeah, this is the tension is the disunion of the plebs and the Roman Senate made the republic free and powerful, right? Is the tension, the contestation between them. And it was that, again, this is why okay, so let's go into this. Yielded honors, but it was, in other words, they were discoursed above Ventus appetite. The motors of this disorder, the engines of this were the Gracchi, whose intentions one should praise more than their prudence. In other words, their intentions are good. This is the road to good. The intentions of the Gracchi are praiseworthy, but their prudence was not. But they lacked. Machiavelli seems to suggest they lacked prudence. For to try to take away a disorder that has grown in a republic And because of this, to make a law that looks very far back is an ill-considered policy. In other words, remember what he said, that there's an ill in the society, and if it's too late, remember, go back to that point he said earlier. He said it a couple chapters ago. He said in a situation, if there's an ill, that it's an ill. And it's rooted in a long time. And you have to go back into it to deal with it. Now, this has been something that's been long accepted. Well, this is an ill-considered policy. Because what? It will only agitate, it will create the people who fear, the people who have will fear losing. They will, and those who lack will want, and they will cause the tension between these two groups. And then what will happen is that they'll get nasty, as he says, they get nasty, and they'll seek extraordinary means, private means, Machiavelli says, because there's no mechanisms to do this, right? And this is, and remember, you'd rather temporize it than to, because if you choose the way of action, there's no solution. There's it seems to be there's no resolute, the policy only leads to, accelerating an evil, right? As was discoursed above at length, right? This again, 16, Discourses 133. One does nothing but accelerate the evil to which the disorder is leading you. So therefore, okay, this is bad, but the way you do this by confronting them as hard as you're doing, accelerates the evil, because it makes the forces more willing to fight to the end. But by temporizing with it, either the evil comes later or eliminates itself on its own time before it reaches its end, right? This is what he repeats. He repeats the teaching he asserted, or the lesson he asserted earlier. It's best to temporize. The mistake that the Gracchi make, Machiavelli asserts here, is they did not follow the lesson that they sought to they sought to address the evil that it was a problem with inherent in the regime, that it was part of their custom, it was something that their memory, and it was difficult to change it. They had no mechanism to change it, and this would require challenging the thing, and that the problem here is that this will accelerate the evil, right? He says, in other words, it does nothing but accelerate the evil which the disorder is leading you. But by temporizing it, the evil will either come later or it eliminates on own time before it reaches its crisis. This is how he ends this chapter. Well, with this, we stop here. This has been a long chapter, so please comment. If you put your comments or questions or issues that you liked here, or issue themes that you wish to discuss or raise. If you liked it, hit the like button. Hit the like button, please. It helps the algorithm in that sense, as do comments. Also, if you've not subscribed, please subscribe and encourage others to subscribe. If you've liked it, share it on social media. Share it on your by email. Share it far and wide to friends. Again, encourage your friends to come check the chapter, check out the channel, check out the other videos that we've covered here on various topics that we in the playlists. Now, if you didn't like it, you can always thumbs down, but say why in the comments, and this way people can learn from things. Next thing is you want to follow me on social media. The social media links below. If you want to know more about me as a scholar and as a researcher, check the academic social media links below the social media links. If you want to help me to do what I do, you can do so financially in that sense through Patreon or Subscribestar, or you can do so by buying one of my books. The books are listed below, and you can order it at your local bookstore, of course, but you can order through an online distributor like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so forth, or through a distributor like or Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Libris, so forth, or directly to the publishers. Well, that's it. We'll turn next to the next chapter. Take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.